Welcome. You are listening to Haunted Histories on Paranormal UK Radio. And hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Haunted Histories on Paranormal UK Radio. Yes, it's me, your history hostess with the mostess, Penny Griffiths-Morgan, coming at you yet again. And today's show is going to be, well, a little bit different because normally I'm the one talking history and my guests are the one talking paranormal. But I'm getting to meet so many fascinating historians that I thought I would swap sides for a while. And I would be the paranormal person and I'd let them do the history. And I got introduced to this chap via something brilliant called the Great War Group, which was one of the people who set it up was the frequently on television and quite sort of lovely sarcasm that she comes across with, Alex Churchill. And she said, you've got to have a chat with Andy. You've got to have a chat with Andy. So I am. Mr. Andy Locke, hello.
Hi. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for agreeing. Much appreciated. I know when I asked you, you said, well, I know nothing about the paranormal. I went, that's fine. I do. I'll fill it.
It's true. I did say I know nothing. I think, there is quite a bit attached to the Great War. And although, I try and stay with the military stuff most of the time, you do end up drifting into some of these stories a little bit, actually.
Well, that's why I do things like Haunted Histories, though, because I think there is such a crossover between history and the paranormal, not just from an evidence perspective. It's like I always say to people, if you get a name come through on one of the many sort of gadgets that we use, and then you can go and find them on a census record, that actual name, or on a muster roll, if we're talking old-fashioned Navy, or on the sort of platoon list or something like that, it gives it that added credibility. And it's also very, I just find the two very interesting to learn about. So, but you're rather intelligent, aren't you, Andy? You're a bit clever.
That is open to debate, I think. I've got some letters after my name and hopefully going to get a few more at some point. But I think quite a lot of study. I don't necessarily know if that means intelligence, but we'll give this a go.
Well, I mean, I'll say he's intelligent. He's actually a postgraduate researcher. He's also a battlefield guide. He also does World War I tutoring. He's also one of the trustees, like I said, at the Great War Group, which if anyone is interested in World War I, go and check out the Great War Group. It's dirt cheap to join. And honestly, the calibre of material that you get sent and everything else is amazing. I'm so glad I subscribed to it. But you're also in the process of studying or researching, I don't know what the technical term would be, for your PhD, and you were telling me beforehand how many words your doctorate thesis or whatever I don't know what the technical terms is. I left school after my A-levels.
We call it a thesis. I'm in a sort of funny stage of researching at the moment. I'm essentially trying to. We had the discussion. Essentially, I'm creating historical rainbow cakes that I then need to take apart and then make the individual cakes up that got cut into the rainbow cakes, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know. I should start explaining this and then get hungry. But
well, when you're as tall as you are, Andy, I'm sure you need quite a few calories to keep going.
That's true.
Yeah. And the other thing that Andy and I have discovered we have in common is rugby. We're both rugby people, although he's quite a bit younger than me. He still plays. I had to retire due to my shoulder and everything else, but we've also got a shared passion for rugby. So we were discussing a couple of the games that had happened recently before we started recording. I'm going to jump straight in here. I mean, a lot of the people I've spoken to through Alex and everything else have been World War One enthusiasts, and I get it. It's like I was saying to you beforehand. I wasn't really into World War One. My historical thing was more aviation and World War Two. But after my mum forced me to read Birdsong, which is a brilliant book, by the way. Anyone who's not read it, you've got to get a copy because it's mind blowing. I started looking more into World War One and discovering the tunnelers and all of that kind of thing. But what is it about World War One that has caused you to want to actually do a doctorate, basically, in it? Why World War One?
So it's a massive conflict. It's huge. It's far-ranging. It's incredibly complicated and very poorly understood. Mm-hmm. I think we're steadily kicking back and pushing back against the kind of Blackadder cliches that I grew up with. I kind of want to say. So it's only in the sort of 90s that things started gaining any kind of traction against that. And now I almost feel like we're going through a golden age of historical work on the First World War that isn't actually necessarily filtering its way through to the general public all that well. Mm-hmm. But there's some incredible scholarship going into it, and not just from the kind of military side. If anything, it's the other way. The kind of military side has been almost left alone, and there's a lot more of the kind of social history, the kind of after effects that the war had on men, women involved in it, and those who came back, those who didn't, and the kind of the architecture and some of the commemorative work as well. Some of the words that come out of the war too. In terms of literature is analysed kind of beyond simply the war poets. Mm-hmm. So you could study for a lifetime and not get it. I actually am doing the kind of tactical and military side of things because that's kind of, I won't say being ignored at the moment, but I'm doing a kind of some narrative work that basically hasn't been done since the immediate aftermath of the war. Yeah. So although it feels like in the last 100 years, surely we've covered every blade of grass with this war, we really, really have not. It's so interesting, and that's why I'm stuck on it.
Okay. But you say that certain aspects of it have been poorly understood, and the Blackadder cliches. I must admit, I loved Blackadder Goes Forth. That end scene in Blackadder Goes Forth, I can watch it over and over again, and it has me in floods of tears every single time. That whole sort of going over. I
love Blackadder. I do. It's a sitcom.
It's not historically accurate, but I mean the whole sort of friends going over the top and probably never coming back again is kind of not wrong, is it? But what cliche? Tell me one of the cliches that you sort of makes you roll your eyes when the student maybe mentions it.
So I mean, I did a tour of Edinburgh Castle a few years ago and went with a guide, and there's a statue of Sir Douglas Haig there at the castle, and she in a kind of short stand there endeavoured to explain that essentially the soldiers, all they ever did for an attack was climb out of their trenches and walk towards the enemy, and I thought, nope. No, they did not. They did other things as well. They developed really quite complex section and platoon tactics, the layers of information to create even a relatively small attack. Say you have one division going into action with 2 brigades. All right, you've got to think of flank protection, you've got to think about fire support, you've got to think about SOS signals, you've got to think about how communication is going to work between kind of the men at the front and the men at kind of advanced battalion HQ and then brigade HQ, and how that's going to feed back to division, how they're going to call on heavy artillery when they need it. You're going to have contact patrol aircraft whizzing round, sounding klaxon horns, which kind of ask the question, where are you? How are you going to signal to that aircraft without getting shot in the process? And so just the levels of information and sophistication that these attacks took on, and we haven't even talked about kind of cavalry and tanks and that sort of stuff. There's just so much to process with it. So yeah, I guess my favorite cliche is, oh, they just climbed out and got machine guns. No, they didn't. They fought hard.
I thought that is one of the things they said, though, about the early stages of it, that they were told to walk. They were told not to run, that it was more intimidating for them to walk towards.
No, it's not a question of more intimidating, really. The only kind of occasions where they're told to sort of move at a steady pace, don't necessarily sprint, is when they're very heavily laden. And so there's certain units. The first day of the Somme is kind of a good example of that. There's certain units that are told don't advance at the double. Don't run. Essentially, because you'll exhaust yourself. You're carrying a lot of equipment. You're going to be expected to advance onto the German second position. Maybe you might have to advance another mile beyond that, and you're carrying loads of ammunition. You're carrying hand grenades. You're carrying protective equipment against gas. You've got your large pack on. You've got a heavy greatcoat in there potentially as well, and so you just got a lot of stuff to carry. They should, in theory, be advancing with the cover of artillery. So sprinting wasn't necessarily needed, they thought. If you lose your barrage, unfortunately, and the Germans get their machine guns out, then you're in big trouble. And as they found. So they don't get everything right.
No, but they're, like you say, Blackadder is it's a sitcom, it's a TV thing, but it's like, I think with all the Blackadder series, they had elements of proper historical accuracy in them, and then other things that they kind of artistic license to make it appealable to the masses, kind of thing. But I say that last ever scene in Blackadder Goes Forth, I am in floods of tears whenever I watch it, because
yeah, you become very attached to them, don't you? The characters.
It's just imagining that in real life. So did you have any relatives in World War I?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I keep finding new ones all the time. Actually, as part of the Great War Group stuff, I gave a little talk on the Salonika front. So the British Army out in sort of northern Greece fighting against the Bulgarians. And I mentioned this to my mother. I'm doing a little thing on Salonika, and she said, "Oh, did you know you had a relative out there?" No, I did not, Mother. And so she has a little dig around, pulls out photo of him. Great Uncle Di, this is who Di Canary. He was a coal miner in Wales. All that side of the family were coal miners in the Rhondda Valley. Yeah. But he was a pit pony boy. Yep. He moving around with ponies. He ended up as a driver in the Royal Field Artillery out in Salonika. So using donkeys and horses to pull guns around. Ended up getting malaria and being invalided out. Returned to the Western Front later on in the war. Again, same job as a driver, driving horses with the Royal Field Artillery. And served the war out there. So that's one I found out about recently. I had two relatives that I know of killed in the war. One on the opening day of the Loos offensive, and another one who was, again, in the artillery, hit by shell fire in 1918. My father's grandfather survived the war and had quite a long life afterwards as well. But he served on the Western Front. 1916 to 1918. So, I've got a lot of family connections as well. And that's another thing that's kind of drawn me to it.
Well, see, that's one of the reasons I was never that interested in it, because I'd always been told none of my family were ever, because a lot of both my parents' families were steel workers. So they were in reserved occupation. So they didn't have to go. And I never questioned it, because that's what I'd always been told. And I remember it was one Christmas about 3 or 4 years ago. I was going through some old photos my parents, and I found one, and I said to my dad, "Who's this?" Because it was obviously early 1900s, and I said, "This is a World War One uniform." And he went, "No, it's not." I said, "It is, Dad. I can show you. This is a World War One uniform." And we didn't know who it was, and we had to do some digging. We found out it was my dad's granddad, and he never knew he'd fought in World War One. And my nan apparently had never talked about it, and he didn't really remember my granddad, because I think he was only about 10 when he died. And started digging into it and found out that my granddad was one of 5, I think there was 8 children, there was 5 boys. Their dad was a station master up in North Yorkshire. All 5 boys went to war. All 5 of them came back.
Oh, good.
The youngest was 15 and a half, and he was naval. But what was interesting is he started digging into his grandfather's sort of history, and I actually I don't think he went out straight away. He was army before the war, went straight out, so he would have gone out with the BEF, the British Expeditionary Forces, if that's the right
Yeah.
word. And he got shot, I think, in the shoulder or something. So he was into one of the sort of the field hospitals, went back, and then got shot in the leg again about 6 months later, and was blighty, got a blighty pass.
Ooh.
But the weird thing was he was in hospital for nearly 2 years with supposed.
Yeah.
Now that to me doesn't make sense. Why treating him for 2 years for a leg wound? To me,
Yeah, depending on the wound, you might go through quite a lengthy process to prevent infections setting in.
I've also two of the hospitals he was in. I know had shell shock units.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I actually think he possibly. I mean, having been shot twice in 6 months, probably going to do something to your brain.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a PTSD case, or it could be, you know, the concussive impacts of shell fire as well. That's a very First World War thing.
But it was fascinating to learn, and then fascinating to find out, you know, about members of the family that we didn't really know about. And I've been up to see their dads. Yeah, so my great grandfather's grave, and the station that he commanded is now a B&B, and it's fascinating, and it's one of the things I say to people. I'm sure you do too. Look into your history, look into your genealogy, because chances are you've got connections to this.
Yeah, it's always closer than you think.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. So this is a paranormal type show as well as history. It's called Haunted Histories. What are your thoughts on the paranormal?
Honestly, as the son of a scientist and a historian, you know, my parents are fairly matter of fact. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd have probably said nope. And then had a chat with my mum, who told me that she'd seen a ghost in the house. Yeah,
Mum, the scientist or the historian?
Mother is the scientist,
right?
So that kind of made me think for a second. And then it's also kind of my work going out on the battlefields. I spend quite a lot of time around where thousands of young men died early. And so, you know, kind of feeling like if there were that element to it, I would have seen it. I'm possibly open to the idea that I am not able to see these things because other people tell me that they have. And I was out with a New Zealand cultural group, a load of Maori lads, who one of them just came up to me as sort of we'd done the commemorative side of things, and we were just getting ready to head home, and said, you know, thank you, really enjoyed the tour. By the way, I've seen a number of the boys that you've been talking about, essentially around the cemeteries and around the battlefields, you know. So yes, there've been a few kind of stop and think moments for me, and I'm much more open to the idea now than I once was, perhaps.
Good. That's good to hear. I mean, I'll always be skeptical. I'll always be questioning of not every experience is a ghost. Like some people, they'll hear like and say, "Oh, it's a ghost." No, it's just someone knocking at your front door. Come on, let's be honest here. But
yeah, that too.
Having been to sites, I say I've not done any of the World War One battlefield sites, but I've done a few of the World War Two ones, and I've had some experiences I've had lots of experiences over sort of time that I can't explain, but I've picked up on things and seen things that I can't, I've talked to parapsychologists, I've talked to other investigators, I can't explain. So I think it is possible. And I think, the amount of, do they know in some of these battlefields, do they know how many bodies there still are from both sides that haven't been?
Yeah, you can form fairly reasonable ideas. I mean, all these casualty lists do kind of stack up, at least with the British, they do. I mean, the British were fairly assiduous record keepers from about sort of 1915 onwards, and we never like to forget anyone. So if you have an identified body, and they were able to identify at the time, record it, bury it, and keep track of it, then you have a named headstone. And there are many, many thousands out, certainly on the Western Front, but other theatres as well. who have these headstones. If your body was not recovered, or not able to be identified for whatever reason, the nature of the fighting often didn't leave very much behind. Artillery was the big killer in the war. Then you're not forgotten. Your name gets put onto a memorial somewhere, and the biggest one of these is at Tietbau, which we were talking about a little earlier, and there's 72,000 names on the Tietbau memorial, which is on the Somme, and that covers the British and South African missing from that area.
Wow.
But there are others, there's the Arras Memorial, 35,000 on that one. The Meningate is the other really big one, 52,000 on that one, 35,000 on the Tyne Cot Memorial, 11,000 each on the Vimy Ridge and Villers-Bretonneux memorials for the Australians and Canadians. The list rather goes on, unfortunately. You're talking about hundreds of thousands.
So if I'm talking from a paranormal perspective, there's an awful lot of people potentially wandering about with, as I would say, no home. Literally, that you could almost see that they're not. If you believe in religion, you believe in being buried in consecrated ground and all that kind of thing. There's an awful lot, and I should think there's, they do believe in sort of investigations and the paranormal, that people sometimes have unfinished business. So this isn't. I'm not saying this is one of them, but it could be someone who had proposed to his sweetheart just before he went to the front and died before he had a chance to marry her. To him, that might be unfinished business, sort of thing. It's one of the theories behind it. But World War I is definitely weird. Hence, I've called the show Weird World War I. There's an awful lot of things that came out of it. I'm not just talking about people's faces when they first saw a tank, or when air warfare first started, and I still almost find it hilarious when I think of the pilots actually battling each other with pistols. I still find it, albeit, what was it, a 2-week life expectancy for a pilot or something?
At its worst, it got sort of around that stage. Yeah, new pilots arriving with the Royal Flying Corps in April 1917.
Yeah,
that was absolutely at its worst.
Yeah. I mean, but I still think it's funny to sort of like, it is almost like dueling at dawn with pistols and stuff, until they worked out how to do the machine gun fire through the propellers and not actually take the propellers out as it was firing. All that kind of wonderful stuff, which is possibly what I'm very interested in. But having flown biplanes myself, I really don't think I'd want to be shot down in one. But there is a lot of weirdness. Like I say, not just some of the inventions that they came up with. And when I did a talk to my son's school's year 6, when it was the centenary, and, you mentioned tanks and you mentioned Little Willie to them, and an 11-year-old be snorting. And then when you tell them that they were told to wee basically on their masks to protect themselves against the gas attacks, that kind of is a bit weird and gross. But one of the early things that came out of World War I was a legend known as the Angels of Mons. And that was attributed to, there was the Battle of Mons, which was very, very early on in the war, wasn't it? It was in the August of 1914.
It's the British Expeditionary Force's first clash with the German army, essentially.
So what would it have been like? Paint me a picture of what it would have been like for the BEF at this point. Obviously, people are still thinking the war's going to be over by Christmas. It's just in the military history. But what would it have been like? What would the conditions have been like? What would they have been facing?
Okay, well, firstly, it's August. It's warm. Mm-hmm. So you've got, a few days earlier, you'll have formed up. After war declared, you're talking about forming up these regular divisions to travel out, so there's a lot of professional soldiers in amongst them. They might need to be topped up with a few part-timers as well, but we're largely a professional force, but quite a small force out there. 4 divisions initially go over. you put it into kind of numbers terms, and actually the British Army sort of transports over about 80,000 men, which is bigger than today's British Army. But compared to, the Germans mobilised 4 million men in 1914, it's not on the same scale. Anyway, this small, largely professional British Army travels over. They're with their mates, and they're not whistling "It's a Long Way to Tipperary." They're whistling kind of "One Man Went to Mow." They're going to work, essentially, these professional soldiers. By the 20th of August, so the war's about 3 weeks old, they're concentrating these 4 divisions around a place called Maubeuge, and then, to conform with the French attacks, which are going on at that time, to try and drive out the invader. They march up to this town called Mons, which is a lovely town, actually, just over the border in Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
And they are essentially strung out along a canal line for a lot of them, to defend against the oncoming Germans. And some cavalry patrols go out on the 22nd. The 22nd is a huge day's fighting for the French, by the way. This is the bloodiest day of the war for any one army. The French lose 27,000 men dead on that day, and double that number wounded. So there's a huge amount of fighting, and they would have
how many soldiers?
They've mobilised hundreds of thousands. The French had a history of conscription and national service. They end up mobilising the better part of 3 million in 1914. So they've got a large kind of trained or semi-trained body of men to call on. The British don't. With the French army, experiencing that loss and starting their kind of fall back towards Paris, the British Army's right flank is rather in the air, and then they essentially have German First Army descend on them. The force facing this 85,000 or so Brits is around about 300,000 Germans. And there's very little prospect of them holding this canal line. And they fight for a day or so, and there's Victoria Crosses awarded. There's some real bravery that goes on, but the numbers are just going to tell. And so what the British Army does is it has to retreat to conform with the French again. They have to start the march south to keep pace with the French army.
And retreating is actually probably more dangerous than attacking in a lot of cases. And the myth of the angels of war comes from, basically what's meant to have happened is that all these phantom bowmen, angels, came down from the clouds and held the Germans at bay so that the British could get away. This is what the myth is. There's supposed to be reports of it having happened, but interesting, what it actually ties in with was a story in the September of 1914 by somebody called Arthur Machen, and he called it The Bowmen. And it was a fiction story that he had published. But for some reason, people started then saying, well, actually, it's real. And supposedly one Brigadier General John Charteris, who we're going to meet again when we talk about the corpse rendering plants, he's supposed to have written a report on it, saying whether it was real or not. The Society of Cyclical Research, which was it's a paranormal investigation research group, actually investigated it, went through as many first-hand accounts as they could, and couldn't actually find any unequivocal proof that it really did happen. But we know that it was when, the British were outnumbered, and there's a reason I'm stressing this. The British were outnumbered. They were being forced back. And as I said, I've always been taught retreating is actually more dangerous than...
It's a fine line between an ordered retreat and a rout. And that's the one thing they're desperate to try and avoid, of course. Now, professional soldiers are actually pretty good at this. And so retreating in decent order is something they can do. But the idea of spiritual guidance, it pops up in a few places.
It does, because I'm going to sort of jump forward almost to the end of the war now, in April 1918, and the Battle of Bethune, which was part of the Battle of Lee in the Flanders area. in the April of 1918, and we have a similar situation. The British are waiting for backup forces, I believe, are outnumbered, taking an absolute pummeling from the Germans. And all of a sudden, the Germans back off and are running scared. And I'm kind of paraphrasing this somewhat. And I did actually write an article about this for Haunted magazine some time ago. But so it's a similar situation. The British are outnumbered. They need to get away because there are, things aren't looking good. And supposedly they capture a German soldier who starts saying, I didn't know you had a cavalry dressed all in white, riding white horses. They rode straight through our bombardment. We couldn't stop them. Have you heard of that one?
Do you know what? This is a fairly new one on me, actually. I mean, the Battle of the actions around Bethune and on the Lys are part of the German spring offensives in 1918, and these were absolutely terrifying. I mean, there's essentially a kind of. It's funny that these stories kind of pop up at moments of real crisis for the British, because the kind of retreat from Mons and the way that's portrayed in the media back at home is really, oh God, we could actually lose this thing. Well, it's similar in early 1918 actually, because with the Russians going into revolution in October 1917, dropping out of the war, the Germans are able to transfer all of their kind of offensive strength to the Western Front. The British Army is weakened by having to send soldiers to Italy as well. And after they launched their attacks, proceeded with huge, epic artillery bombardments. These get going in late March, and by sort of April and May time, they're transferring the offensive effort further north because their actions, towards Amiens have stalled. And so, these Lys actions are a real threat to break through. And if they do break through, get to Hasbrook first, that's a major rail junction, then get to the Channel ports, that could be curtains for the British Army. So there's a real fear of, God, we could actually lose the war at this time.
But it's interesting. There is such a similarity to the Angels of Mons with the Ghost Cavalry. Now, I've actually got there's a transcription that was put into a report that was written by a chap by the name of Captain Cecil Whitewick, also known as Cecil Whitewick Hayward, and it's actually from the Germans to do with it. Shortly afterwards, our machine guns opened a heavy fire, raking the advancing cavalry with a dense hail of lead. But they came quietly forward through the shells. Though the shells were bursting amongst them with intensified fury, not a single man or horse fell. Now, supposedly those are first-hand accounts of watching this as I call them, the Ghost Cavalry, come through and manage to stop the fighting and actually disperse the Germans so that the British were okay. What I can't find is any similar stories told from a German perspective. I mean, you and I were talking on Messenger about, we were going to talk about some of the propaganda stories, the Crucified Canadian and the corpse rendering plant in a minute. But why does there seem to be such a lack of these kind of we're in the right stories, but from the Central Powers perspective, do you think?
I think they're a little bit kind of shorter than maybe the Anglophone press is when it comes to, I want to say, stories of beastliness.
Yeah.
These are quite common actually, and at certain times in the war as well. So September 1914, when you have the Bowmen story, you've also got stories about German soldiers, sticking Belgian babies on spikes and burning down beautiful libraries,
all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And these rumble on. I mean, we talk. Yeah, we're going to mention the kind of corpse rendering thing, and that sort of initially comes along when British offensives are starting to stall, and there's maybe the kind of desire to kind of just remember why we're fighting in this war. And and then like I say, the kind of the Ghost Cavalry comes along at a moment of great stress again. So it's when the war seems to not be going well, you get these stories about horrible Germans and their horrible behavior The first use of poison gas, for example, is in April 1915, around about the time that the Angel of Mons story is almost developing a life of its own as well. And there's there's the feeling in the general public that if the Germans are so horrible, then no Christian God would support them, and so it makes sense, quite frankly, for supernatural forces to be on the side of our righteous chaps.
Yeah, but they say that when you actually, as you say, that's one of the myths, really, isn't it? When you start digging down into it, everyone was just doing a job. Do you think that the German side was any worse than us? If you get what I mean?
No, I mean, there's certainly plenty of stories of what would be considered war crimes. I mean, the old too late chum mentality comes along. Say you're attacking a position and a German machine gun's been firing all day. It's held your battalion up and killed God knows how many of your mates. And you're just breaking through. You've just managed to get through the wire, and you're onto the machine gun pit, and you're there, and the crew all of a sudden sticks his hands up in the air and says, "Oh, I surrender." Nah, too late, chum. And through goes the bayonet. And so, yeah, there are definitely stories of British and Commonwealth soldiers doing that kind of thing. Less so kind of actions towards the civilian population. I mean, the German soldiers themselves would point to franc-tireurs, which are kind of essentially civilians with guns shooting at German soldiers as they go through. So, German reprisals would often kind of involve stories around franc-tireurs and the fact that these aren't just simple civilians that they're taking out their anger on. But I think there are fewer stories of atrocities like burning libraries, for example. The British tend not to do that, but they're an allied force in a friendly country, so they wouldn't.
It's one of those things. It's something that my husband and I discuss, and you because you tend to read history from the winners, you don't tend to see it from the other side. And he's really interested in reading sort of books, World War II more than anything at the moment, but from the German perspective, like what they were trying to achieve and the experiences they had, because I like learning both sides. Actually, there's three sides almost, isn't there? Is the social side, the one side, and then the other side, and you pair them all together. But there are loads of stories. There's quite a few books. I know there's one by it's Owen Davies called The Supernatural War, which has loads of different sort of out of body experiences. There's a story of a soldier this soldier actually gave this as a first hand account. I can't for the life of me think what his name was. So he was like a private. His brother had been killed about 6 months previously, and he was asleep under a tarpaulin with some other soldiers. They were waiting for a battle call or whatever the term would be. And he remembers dreaming and his brother leading him somewhere else in the trench. And he wakes up and finds himself somewhere else in the trench. And when he goes back to where he was, where he'd fallen asleep, it had been shelled and everyone was dead.
Oh, wow.
And there's quite a lot of stories like that. There's stories, I mean, when you start sort of really digging into it, you can look at people like the infamous Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame. He was a spiritualist, and a lot of people think he became a spiritualist because of the fact he lost a brother-in-law and his son due to World War I. He was actually a spiritualist before then, and he was sort of, he wanted to talk. He wanted to look into it and the possibility to talk to people. You had a physicist called Sir Oliver Lodge, whose son Raymond died, I think it was in 1915, so relatively early on. He wrote a book about it called Raymond, or Life and Death, after having lots of sort of seances with a famous trance medium at the time called Gladys Osborne Leonard, and he believes he did actually speak to his son, Raymond. So you've got all these people who are actually meant to be quite, shall I say, level-headed. Actually, the sense of loss must have been so much. I do wonder if there was paranormal activity or supernatural activity, whatever you want to call it. It was that whole kind of group psyche, almost making things almost like a group telekinesis, I suppose you could call it, like channeling. Because, I mean, by probably sort of 1917, when it really was getting really, really bad, how many soldiers do you think had died on both sides? How many deaths had there been on both sides, taking into account all the countries, by sort of 1917, when it got really bloody?
By 1917, okay. So, I mean, total deaths for the British are around about 800,000 or so. But I mean, this really kind of ramps up from 1915. You know, they're not too many in 1914 because the army's so small. So you probably. Yeah, 1918 was a really heavy year's fighting. You're probably ballparking somewhere in the region of around about, if we think that about 10 million died in the war as a total, then you're probably ballparking around about 7.5 million by 1917.
Wow.
So it's big numbers.
Yeah.
And this is the Americans only just get involved at that point, and they do get stuck into it. Obviously, the Russians lose a lot.
That was going to say that people forget about the Russians. The amount, I mean, when I was looking actually at the figures, something, I don't know how accurate it was, and it was saying something like the British about 800,000 by that point, the Russians about 2.5 million. And when you start looking at those kind of figures, it's quite mind-blowing, really. So when you're looking at that level of death, you're looking at that level of loss, probably every family in Britain would have experienced loss of some sort, whether it was an immediate relative or a slightly more distant one, or would have known someone who had.
Yeah.
It's not surprising, really, that people were almost looking for contact. They were looking, and also from a paranormal, and this is where you need to suspend your disbelief or whatever for a second. It's not surprising that some of these people might have come back and sort of said, "It's all right, I'm fine, don't worry about me," because that some of their deaths were so violent and so abrupt that they probably hadn't even realised they were dead. That's another belief. But let's go on to something else that's a bit gruesome, because I say there's all these stories, you can find them. Like I say, that the book by Owen Davies is really good. There's another one by James Hayward, which is really, really interesting to read on World War One and some of the weirder supernatural aspects. But another story I found that is quite a well-known one is that of the crucified Canadian. Have you read anything about that one?
Again, this is one that sort of pops up occasionally. That we're a little bit short of, clear evidence, and those who really did see it and didn't just hear it from someone else. One little article I saw about because the pretext of this is the fighting around Ypres in sort of late April 1915, and you do have that first German use of poison gas, chlorine gas, released on the 22nd of April, and sort of defending if you think of the Ypres salient as a kind of bulge in the lines around the town of Ypres, if you take kind of Ypres as the centre of a clock face and go out at sort of 2:00, the Canadians are sort of defending that area. And so sort of they throw out a defensive left flank to try and contain the German breakthrough, where they've seemed to be breaking through a section of the line held by the French after their poison gas release. A couple of days later, they launch another poison gas attack against the Canadians, and casualties are duly taken, and the Germans advance slightly. And in the wake of that, it seems that a Canadian soldier was found crucified to a piece of wood, whether it's a tree or whether it's a barn door or something like that.
Frame of a barn door. Yeah. Well, the story goes that supposedly some Dublin Fusiliers were marching back, and they saw this Canadian soldier, and they identified him as a Canadian soldier because of his uniform. He was crucified using multiple bayonets against this barn, like the wooden structure of a barn door, and he was later I'm saying identified with air speech marks, if you go what I mean, as one Sergeant Harry Band of the Central Ontario Regiment. It's never been proved again, unequivocally, that that's who it was. But it was one of those things that it was, was it meant to garner more hatred towards the Germans, to make more people want to fight? Because that would have been before the conscription sort of thing, wouldn't it? EAP or wipers.
Certainly was.
Yeah, wipers.
Yeah.
All that. I'll say wipers because I've used that before, and people go, no, it's EAP, it's EAP. And I said, no, it's nicknamed wipers. It's just a, yeah. So it was before all of that. So was it just to sort of motivate people to keep wanting to fight who were already out there? I don't know, but it was definitely a story that started going about. And then there was also articles, and I read some of these in newspapers, and it was a Canadian newspaper that basically said that of course it would be a Canadian soldier who was crucified because the Germans hated them even more than the British, because they didn't see why the Canadians had to come and join somebody else's battle. So definitely Sergeant Harry Band was actually was in EAP at that time, and he was missing, MIA. So it could have been him. But the other field of thought is that he wasn't actually bayoneted. He was actually put up with wire, and he was already dead, and it was meant to be as a warning to other people. It was still being debated a good 2 years after the war finished as to whether it really happened or not. And I mean, to begin, some of the stories where it was 6 or 7 soldiers all crucified against that barn door. It's pretty gruesome stuff, really, sort of, especially when you think about, and again, you've got that whole sort of almost theological element of it, haven't you? That he was a martyr being crucified for daring up to the altar.
There were also sort of discussions about whether Canada was going to introduce conscription as well. So there's nothing like an atrocity committed against a Canadian to motivate a discussion like that at home.
Exactly. So do we think it happened?
Well, I will say I did look up the whereabouts of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and around this time, and 1st Battalion was off about to attack Turkey. So they weren't anywhere near, and 2nd Battalion is the only real other battalion that it could possibly be. Were off in a different town. So I'd maybe question the veracity of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers testimony, but that doesn't necessarily rule it out altogether.
But doesn't it also sound very similar to some of the field punishments, albeit they weren't bayoneted to wood? But wasn't there a field punishment where it almost looked like you were...
Yeah, field punishment number 1, you're lashed to a gun wheel. Sophisticated stuff. Yeah. Minus bayonets through the hands, yeah.
Well, I was going to say without the bayonets, yes. But it's interesting that, again, you've got that whole sort of God is on our side and we've got a martyr and everything else. But the last one I'm going to come to is the one that you said, I know a bit about this when we were talking about the different things, and it is, well, trust a boy to know about this because it's revolting. And in fact, when I was talking to my husband about this last night, saying this is one of the things I'm going to be talking about, he actually went, ugh, the corpse rendering plant.
Yeah.
Really? And I know people believe this because, again, I found newspaper articles talking about it from the time. Really?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a decent little book about this, actually, by one of my old lecturers at the University of Wolverhampton, Stephen Badsey. And on the front cover of it, there's a cartoon of the Kaiser and one of his young soldiers. And the caption says, and don't forget, your Kaiser will find a use for you, alive or dead. And the Kaiser, or the German officer with the pointy helmet, is pointing off to a factory that says Cadaververwertung Anstalt, which is quite simply an establishment for the utilization or exploitation of carcasses. I want to say.
Ultimate in recycling.
Say again, sorry?
The ultimate in recycling.
Well, yeah, this is it. I mean, it all spun from an article in a sort of local paper in Germany, because, our press were looking at the German press, and, our intelligence were looking at German kind of what was being reported. And it wasn't kind of a first page thing at all. But there's a mention of this establishment, this Cadaververwertungsanstalt, and here's where translation kind of gets a little bit funny, because cadaver to us means, Harry Potter spells notwithstanding, a dead person, really. Whereas in German, it can mean animal carcass, really. And I think that's what they're talking about. You're talking about the sort of rendering down of like horse carcasses. For various things. But anyway, the London press picks this ball up and runs with it in 1917. It's in the Times, it's in the Mail, it's in the Evening News, all the Northcliffe press, really. Talking about how the Germans are such rotten rotters, they're boiling down their own people to turn them into explosives or glue or whatever it is.
The article I found was actually in the Cleveland Advertiser, April 1917, and it was saying how it was describing in great detail, and it really was in great detail, how they would wrap up 3 or 4 bodies at a time with iron wire. They would put them in trucks that had the initials DAVG on the side. Now, I can't speak German, but apparently that stood for Deutsche Abfall Gesellschaft or something.
Oh, yeah.
And they would be put on a train line to Koblenz, of which they would be unloaded at this corpse rendering plant where the men who worked there lived there as well. And they had their own sanatorium, and they expected not to leave. And these bodies would be soaked or boiled for 7 to 8 hours, and they would be used for the oils and fats and pig food. And somebody said, why didn't they do that to horses? And they went, horses, the meat was too valuable. They could eat that, so they didn't do it to horses. And you're thinking, well, I guess that does explain what to do with dead bodies, because you don't want them decomposing and stuff, because disease and everything else. But my immediate question was, did they do that to any dead body that they found, or was it just German bodies?
Well, I think the press would have us believe that they were taking any old corpses back, including our own ones. It's possibly worth mentioning at this stage that in 1918 there were some Australian troops who were convinced that they'd found one of these things as well. The kind of Allied advances were going on in the second half of the year, because they found what essentially was stoves and heaters with kind of pots and things on, and human bones in amongst it as well. So this, seemed to vindicate the story completely. Any kind of claim that it was a lie, it can't be, because we've got it. This is one here. And then I think what it actually turned out to be was actually a German field kitchen that had taken an artillery round, and the crew, or rather, the team that would work on it, had quite literally been blown into the soup, as it were. So that was, sort of kind of talked down a little bit from the initial excitement of finding one of these corpse.
So, but the interesting thing is, I mentioned that Brigadier General John Charteris, when I was talking about the Angel of the Morn, he was the one who was writing reports up on the corpse rendering plants as well. He was the intelligence person who wrote a report on that as well. And it's like, is it him who spread all the rumours?
Well,
was he
Charters
like a PR man rather than intelligence?
Well, he's a funny old fella, John Charters. He was quite high ranked. He was Haig's, intelligence officer through 1917, while the sort of Third Ypres offensive is going on, and so he's the one kind of feeding back to Haig, really, that the Germans are close to defeat. They're close to defeat. Keep going, and we'll get them this time. That for which Haig is so heavily criticised. In 1917, this idea that they just kept bashing away hopelessly was actually in no small part down to the information that he was receiving. So Charters didn't last too much longer after that. I do not put it past him at all that with a bit of a nudge and a wink, he would let this story go on. And I think that the British government as well, don't bear responsibility for the story necessarily, but I think they certainly didn't take it upon themselves to correct anyone. They didn't see it as their job to say, oh, no, hang on a minute, we don't think the Germans are doing that. If the press wants to report that the Germans are rotten, horrible people doing nasty things, it's not the job of the British Army or the British government to say, no, actually, they're not quite as bad as all that. Okay, so it's a kind of a thing that they let go, really. And it's only kind of after the war that you actually get people saying, yeah, it's totally made up.
But when you look at some of the propaganda posters that were put out around that time, the Germans were meant to be seen as beasts and monsters and everything else. So yeah, like you say, you don't want to sanitize that view at all. But ironically, if you think about it, what they did 25 years later actually wasn't far off the rumor that went round about them in World War One. I mean, we know of some of the gruesome things that were done to people, and lampshades being made out of prisoners' skins and stuff like that. So I guess it's and that is true. That's been verified on multiple occasions. So I suppose it's but it's some of the things that we're looking at it now. You just think, would they really? It's all a bit weird and all a bit gruesome. But I guess, like I said, I mean, for a soldier seeing a tank coming at them for the first time, they'd probably uttered a few, what the, because that would have motorized warfare and and heavy artillery, and they were all things that people had never dealt with. So they were a bit weird.
I dare say, yeah, there's incredible progress in many, many ways, and not all of it is pleasant progress.
No. Seeing aeroplanes overhead and all of that would have been something completely alien.
I mean, that's a point of fascination for them a lot of the time. The number of notes that I see in the war diaries, they could be describing a whole day's events, and it'll be nothing but an aeroplane flew over at one point. So that kind of stuff still holds absolute fascination for them.
Still holds fascination for me, and I've had aeroplanes around me. I still get excited when aeroplanes fly over where I live.
Yeah, you can't help but look up, can you?
You can't, especially if I hear an old engine, say like a biplane type engine or piston engine or whatever, all those kind of things, and still look up to watch them. I can't help it. So for you, do you think there is any truth in the corpse rendering? Or do you think it was a case of dealing with animal corpses? Because we do know, we know on the British side, millions of animals died. And we know that at the end of the war, rather than bring back all the horses, and it's not just from the film War Horse, but, rather than bring back all the animals, they basically destroyed them.
Yeah, I'm afraid I do. I think it is just that. I think it's animal processing rather than human processing. I know the German... knowing a little bit about sort of how they carried out their burials as well, they're not without a spiritual side at all. The Germans, they went to war with, just to even take the example of their belt buckle. It says "Gott mit uns" on it, God with us, and they take their cemeteries are quite funny places to visit. They're often they've got trees growing throughout there as well, and whereas the kind of British Commonwealth cemeteries are pristine and manicured lawns and beautiful planting and lovely white headstones, which are kept spick and span. It's really not the end of the world if a few leaves fall around the kind of German headstones, or a bird poos on them, or some moss grows on there, because there's the feeling that they're returning to nature. So I don't really see that as a realistic prospect, that they were boiling humans down to make explosives. Even in desperate stages, I doubt they would have done it.
Okay. So for you personally, what's the weirdest thing about World War One? The thing that when you've read it or learned it, you've just gone, nah, can't be true.
I'm inclined to go with the bowmen. And, the story. I think the funniest thing about the story is the poor old author, because essentially, he goes through 1915 thinking, hang on a minute, no, this is not what I wrote this thing for, he writes a little thing in July 1915, no escape from the bowmen. I saw Frankenstein made a monster to his sorrow. I've begun to sympathise with him. But, he then tries to set the record straight and, he gets it republished with a big sort of chunk about how he made it up. And this didn't have the intended effect at all. It became bestseller. There's lots more accounts then of people saying, "Oh yeah, I saw the bowmen, I saw the angels." You've got people then coming out and saying, "Oh, he's not very patriotic if he thinks this story isn't real." Like, oh, hang on a minute, I made the thing up. So he sort of comes under fire from people saying it is true, it is. Oh God, really?
The thing is, there's so many other stories. I mean, we could talk about the Vanishing Battalion, the Sandringhams, who people appeared into the loaf cloud. Wrote an article about that for Haunted Magazine as well. We could talk about the Beast of No Man's Land. The fact that they were supposed to be either feral humans living in the tunnels underneath or an actual beast that would come out to take chunks out of, and people supposedly heard it howling at night, although I actually think it was possibly the people who were in the middle of dying in no man's land howling, is the noise a human makes when they're in pain.
I was going to make a derogatory comment about the French when you said feral humans for a second.
Keep it clean. Yes, but there's also that as well. I mean, there are so many. But yes, the Sandringhams one is a very interesting one. But we're nearly out of time. But I've written about that one as well. So there's all these stories about weird shit that happened in the war, and I sometimes think, well, maybe some of it could have been because of the sort of density of the action, but could also some of it have been due to there was men who were malnourished, sleep deprived, scared out of their minds, and they were hallucinating.
Yeah, fatigue, stress, and under immense strain. Having seen horrible things, and the mind is a funny thing, isn't it?
Isn't it just? So, if people want to sort of find out about your work that you do, your research, everything else, Andy, how do they locate you?
Well, I mean, I've got a little bit of work coming out later this year as part of a sort of edited volume, and that will be edited by Spencer Jones.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to be writing bits for the Great War Group. Our latest journal has come out. It's got a little bit on German politics in it, written by me. Otherwise, get in touch on Twitter. I am Big Andy Lock, nice and simple. And
his surname is Lock by name and Lock by position in rugby.
Absolutely, yeah. Coincidence.
Fortuitous, yes. Yes, I do say the Great War Group. I mean, when I got my first copy of Salient Points through, I did not expect a book of information like that. It's a really, if you're interested in history and you're interested in learning about World War One, it's a great group to subscribe to. And one of the things I do want to say about the group is the followers, the trustees, I suppose the bosses in Beth and Alex. No question is a stupid question.
No, we
Go on, sorry, Andy.
No, I was just going to say it's a real kind of point of principle for us. We are desperate not to appear in any way kind of off-putting, or this is just a club for the super knowledgeable and people who have all the answers. It really isn't, and we don't claim to have all the answers either, but we will often know where to look, if you know what I mean, to help people out.
Yeah, because I know I asked a question that I was pretty sure I knew the answer from, but my son wanted to know the answer and he wouldn't listen to me because apparently I don't know as much as Alex does. So I did ask, and he was chuffed to pieces that Alex replied to him with an answer. So, yeah, it's a great group, and I do think there needs to be more awareness of World War One. I mean, one of the worst answers I did when I did a little thing in the centenary to the year sixes at my son's school, and I asked them, what is the Great War also known by? And I had at least one put Vietnam.
Oh, God.
By the end of my little lecture, they knew some quite sort of information you'd expect 10 to 11-year-olds to know. We're not talking about a master's degree in it, but they knew enough of the basics that they knew Vietnam was no. Also, one of them asked if Winston Churchill was Prime Minister during World War One, and I was like,
he was definitely involved, but not quite Prime Minister.
He was definitely involved. Made some pretty diabolical decisions as well, in my opinion. But no, he wasn't the Prime Minister. So it is one of those things, I think, and I do think it's got something for all age groups. It's not just a one that nerdy historians are going to get into. I mean, you read up about the Red Baron or something like that. I mean, that's got to appeal to young boys, right? The Red Baron?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, any kind of lively, when the air war kind of sells itself, as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, just also stories of bravery and dash are just fun apart from anything else.
And it's not just the boys, the girls get involved too.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Andy.
Pleasure.
Obviously, if anyone wants, he is Big Andy Lock over on Twitter. You can catch hold of him then, or just go and look up the Great War Group, and he's very involved in that. I'm not going to tell you who my next guest is going to be for my next show because I'm going to leave it as a surprise. So if you do have any questions that you want me to give to Andy following the show, feel free to drop me a line at Haunted Histories on Facebook or Twitter. I don't mind which, or drop me an email via the website. It's absolutely fine. But on that note, have a good evening, everybody. Sleep tight. And don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.